Welcome to another deep dive. And this time, we're tackling something really fundamental to how we live, democracy. Specifically, we're looking at this book, Democracy for Realists, which, well, it kind of throws a wrench in a lot of those nice ideas we often have about how it all works.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. Like, we grow up with this, almost romanticized vision of voters thoughtfully weighing the issues, carefully comparing candidates, the whole shebang.
Right, like we picture ourselves in the voting booth, super informed,
Yeah.
making those rational choices. But this book, it's like, hold on a second, it might not be quite that straightforward.
It really digs into that. In fact, they call it the folk theory of democracy, this idea that it's all based on individual, rational consideration. And democracy for realists uses a ton of evidence to kind of poke some holes in that theory.
So what are they saying? Are they saying we're all just clueless out there?
No, not clueless, but maybe not as, how to put it, not as perfectly rational as we like to imagine. One of the big points they make is that group identities, things like social class, religion, the groups we belong to, they have a much bigger impact on our voting decisions than we might
Oh,
realize.
really? You mean like even more than the actual policy positions of the candidates?
That's what they're arguing, yeah. We tend to align ourselves with groups that share our values and experiences, which makes sense, right? But then we sort of absorb the political beliefs and voting patterns of those groups, whether we realize it or not.
So it's less about like me sitting down and comparing stances on every issue and more about this sort of like group influence that's happening under the surface.
Exactly. It's like birds of a feather flock together, but for politics.
Okay, so that's already a pretty big twist. But then they go even further with this idea of blind retrospection, right?
Yeah.
And that's where things get really interesting.
Oh, yeah. Blind retrospection. It's this fascinating phenomenon where voters basically punish or reward politicians for things that are totally outside their control. Like, remember when the economy tanked right before that election and everyone blamed the incumbent president, even though, like, global economic trends were the real culprit?
Yeah, yeah. Or like if there's a natural disaster
Yeah.
and suddenly the people in charge are held responsible, even if there's nothing they could have done to prevent it.
It's almost like we have this deep-seated need to blame someone to find a scapegoat, even if it doesn't logically make
It's
sense.
kind of wild, right? And the book even has this crazy example about Woodrow Wilson maybe losing votes because of shark attacks. Shark attacks.
Right. In 1916, it sounds ridiculous, but it highlights a point.
Yeah.
If something as random as a shark attack can sway voters, what does that tell us about how rational we really are in the voting booth?
It kind of makes you question that whole idea of voters carefully evaluating a politician's record, doesn't it?
For sure. It's definitely more complicated than we often assume.
No kidding. So we've got these group dynamics pulling at us, maybe more than we realize, and that we're making judgments based on things politicians can't even control.
It paints a pretty different picture of democracy, that's for sure.
Yeah, it definitely challenges some of those idealistic notions we might hold.
Makes you wonder if we're all giving ourselves a little too much credit for being, these perfectly rational voters.
Right. So if it's not just me in the voting booth weighing all the pros and cons, like what is it then? What's really making those decisions happen?
Well, the book really dives into this idea that it's groups, not individuals, who are really driving the political machine.
Groups. So you're telling me my individual vote, like, it doesn't even really matter.
No, no, your vote absolutely matters, don't get me wrong. But it's important to see how it fits into this bigger picture, right?
Hmm.
The book argues that even political parties, they're not so much about ideology as they are about coalitions of different groups.
Coalitions, like
Yeah.
alliances.
Yeah, exactly. And these groups, they're often more about shared identities and loyalties than, perfect agreement on every single issue. Think about it. Within a political party, you'll have people who might disagree on certain specifics, but they feel like they belong to that group.
Oh, so it's like those group identities we were talking about before. They're not just influencing me as a voter, they're like shaping the whole political landscape.
That's the argument, yeah. But here's the thing, not all groups are created equal, right? Some groups have more resources, more influence, they can make their voices heard more effectively.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like some groups are shouting and others are whispering, and it's hard to hear those whispers sometimes.
Exactly. And this is where the book is pushing us to, really think about the limits of that folk theory idea of democracy. Like, are we really representing everyone's interests if some groups consistently have more power than others?
Yeah, it kind of makes you wonder, like, are some voices just getting drowned out completely? Is that what's happening?
It's a valid concern. And this is where Democracy for Realists tries to get us to think about alternatives, different ways of understanding how democracy works. Not to throw it out altogether, but to make it more equitable, more inclusive.
So it's not about pretending that everyone has an equal voice. It's about actually figuring out how to level the playing field.
Exactly. And they do offer some ideas, some concrete things we could do, like strengthening campaign finance rules so that wealthy donors don't have so much sway,
Huh.
or helping marginalized groups organize and advocate for their interests more effectively.
Okay, so it's about spreading the power around a bit more,
Hmm.
making sure decisions aren't just made by the loudest voices in the room.
Right. It's about creating a system where deliberation and compromise are actually happening between different groups, not just within them.
This is a lot to take in. We started with this image of voters carefully choosing their leaders, and now we're talking about like power dynamics and group influence, and it's a whole different way of looking at things.
Yeah, it's definitely eye-opening, isn't it? But I gotta say, even though Democracy for Realists is, kind of shaking up those rosy images we might have, it doesn't exactly leave you feeling totally hopeless.
Not at all. I mean, in a way, it's almost empowering, right? That, like, once you understand these dynamics, you're better equipped to actually, do something about them.
So then where do we go from here? If we're accepting that, okay, these group dynamics exist, these power imbalances are there, what can we actually do to make democracy work better for everybody? Like, are there solutions?
Well, they do offer some suggestions, yeah. One of the big things they talk about is fostering a stronger sense of shared identity.
Hmm.
Like, yeah, we belong to different groups, but we're also all part of this larger community, right?
Yeah.
And finding that common ground is crucial. I get that, but it seems like everything is so polarized these days.
Hmm.
Everybody's retreating into their little corners of the internet, yelling at each other. How do you even begin to bridge those divides?
Yeah, it's tough for sure. But the book talks about things like, promoting civic education, encouraging dialogue between different groups, reminding people that we're all human, we all want the same basic things.
So instead of just arguing about like specific policies all the time, maybe we need to start by remembering that, hey, we all want a healthy planet. We all want safe communities. We all want our kids to have good lives.
Exactly. It's about shifting the focus from us versus them to we. And that means not just changing attitudes, but also changing the systems, the structures, making things more fair, more inclusive.
So like those campaign finance reforms and empowering marginalized groups that we talked about.
Yeah, exactly. And they even suggest exploring different electoral systems, things like ranked choice voting or proportional representation. These could help, give smaller parties and independent candidates a better shot instead of it always being this winner-take-all situation.
Hmm, interesting. It's a lot to think about, but it is kind of inspiring. Like we don't have to just accept that democracy is broken. We can actually try to fix it.
Right. It's about being realistic, not cynical, understanding the challenges, but also believing that things can change. And that means, we all have to be informed, we have to participate, we have to be willing to challenge the status quo.
That's a good point.
Oh,
It's not a spectator sport, right?
yeah,
We all got to be in the game if we want it to work.
exactly.
Well, I think that's a fantastic takeaway from our deep dive into Democracy for Realists. We started out, maybe with some idealistic notions and we got a little reality check, but ultimately I think we came out of it with a sense of, well, possibility. What do you think?
I'd say so, yeah. It's a good reminder that democracy, it's messy, it's imperfect, but it's still the best system we've got. And the more we understand how it really works, the better we can make it work for everyone.
Well said. So to all you deep divers out there, keep questioning, keep learning, and most importantly, keep pushing for a better democracy. It's a fight worth having. And that's it for our deep dive today. Until next time, happy exploring.